I told Patricia on a Monday morning in April. I said, I am going to Lisbon for 6 months. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, Lisbon, Portugal. I said, yes. She said, for 6 months. I said, yes. I leave in September. I have found an apartment near the water. The rent is reasonable. The light there is different from the light here. I read that in 3 different books, and I want to find out if it is true. She said, Eleanor, the house. I said, I am not selling the house. I am leaving it for 6 months. Lucas has a key. She said, Lucas has earned a key. I said, yes, he has. She said, what about Dr. Reeves? I said, I have a cardiologist contact in Lisbon. Dr. Reeves approved the trip last week. He said maintenance, not emergency, and that 6 months in a warm climate with good olive oil was not the worst prescription he could imagine. She said, he is not wrong about the olive oil. I said, no, he is not. She said, Eleanor, why Lisbon? I thought about the answer. I said, because Richard always said we would go. We had a list. Paris, Lisbon, Kyoto. He died before we went anywhere on the list. I said, I have been sitting in Connecticut for 9 years waiting for the right time to start the list. I said, I am 63 years old. There is no right time. There is only Tuesday. She said, when did you decide this? I said, Saturday morning, in the garden. The lavender was doing something interesting in the wind. Patricia said, you decided to move to Lisbon because of the lavender. I said, I decided to move to Lisbon because I am not finished yet. My name is Eleanor Brooks, 63 years old, Connecticut, retired teacher, widow. Let me tell you about the list. Richard and I made it in 1987. We had been married for 9 years. Lucas was 3 years old. We had just paid off the car and were feeling the particular lightness of people who have one less thing weighing on their monthly budget. We were sitting on the back porch on a summer evening, and Richard said, when we have more time, where do you want to go? I said, everywhere. He said, be specific. I got a piece of paper. We wrote for 40 minutes. Paris in autumn, Lisbon in any season, Kyoto for 2 weeks in March when the cherry trees bloom, the coast of Amalfi, a small island off the coast of Greece whose name I had read in a travel magazine and could not pronounce correctly, New Zealand, because Richard had read something about the light there and wanted to see it with his own eyes. 14 places. We folded the paper and put it in a book. The book was a collection of essays about cities that I had been reading and had left on the kitchen windowsill. When Richard died, I found the list still in the book. I had not moved the book. For 9 years, the list had been sitting in the book on the kitchen windowsill. I had looked at it occasionally. I had thought, not yet. Not the right time. Too much to manage here. Too much still to settle. 9 years of not yet. The Saturday morning in April, when I decided to go to Lisbon, I was in the garden. The lavender was doing something in the wind that it only does in April when the temperature is exactly right. A particular movement that makes the whole row of it seem to breathe. I stood watching it for a long time. Then I went inside. I took the list out of the book. I read all 14 places. I thought about Richard saying, be specific. I thought about 9 years of not yet. I thought about Margaret Solis in the hospital waiting room saying, I have been doing everything alone and telling myself it is what strength looks like. I thought about the essay I had written about the courage of the ordinary, about choosing the Tuesday, about the particular smallness of choosing to remain in the thing that is yours. And I thought, the list is mine. Richard and I made it together, but he is not here to do it, and I am. And waiting for the right time to begin the list is exactly the kind of not choosing I had written 3,000 words to argue against. I called Patricia on Monday. I said, I am going to Lisbon for 6 months. I spent April and May preparing. The apartment I found was on a steep street in the Alfama district. 3 rooms, a small terrace, a view of the river that appeared between 2 buildings at a particular angle. The landlord was a woman named Teresa, who communicated entirely through a translation app and who had included in the listing a note that said, "The morning light here is something you will not believe until you see it." I believed her immediately. I called Dr. Reeves. He reviewed my medications. He gave me the contact for a cardiologist colleague in Lisbon. He said, "Eleanor, you are stable. You are 63. Go." I told Lucas in May. He came for Sunday dinner, and I told him over the green beans. He put down his fork. He said, "Lisbon." I said, "Yes." He said, "For 6 months." I said, "September through February." He said, "Mom, the house." I said, "You have a key. The lavender needs trimming in October. Linda will come if you call her." He said, "I know how to call Linda." I said, "Good." He said, "Mom, are you all right?" I said, "I am very well. That is why I am going." He said, "I do not understand." I said, "I have been sitting in this house for 9 years since your father died, taking care of things, addressing situations, managing the pattern. I have been very good at staying." I said, "I want to find out what happens when I go." He said, "What if something happens here?" I said, "Lucas, you are 38 years old. You have Patricia's number and Margaret's number and the locksmith's number and Linda's number. You will be fine." He said, "What if something happens to you?" "In Lisbon." I said, "Then it happens in Lisbon, with good olive oil and light that comes in at an angle I have never seen before." He looked at me for a long time, then he said, "Dad would have loved this." I said, "Yes, he would have been on the phone to the airline before I finished the sentence." Lucas said, "He always wanted to go." I said, "I know. We made a list in 1987, 14 places. Lisbon was second." He said, "What was first?" I said, "Paris in autumn." He said, "And after Lisbon." I said, "We will see." If you have ever stood in a garden watching lavender move in the wind and decided something important, stay with me. Because what happened 3 weeks before I was supposed to leave for Lisbon is something I did not plan for. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every week. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening in August, 3 weeks before my September departure. The apartment was booked. The flights were booked. My medications had been reviewed and packed in 2 separate bags as Dr. Reeves had instructed. Teresa had sent me photographs of the terrace in the August light and a voice message through the translation app that said, "The river is very beautiful this time of year. You will love it." I was sitting on my own back porch in Connecticut, reviewing my packing list when the phone rang. The number was not one I recognized. I answered. A woman's voice. She said, "Is this Eleanor Brooks? The Eleanor Brooks who taught at Westfield High School?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My name is Anna Chen. I am calling from the Hartford Courier. I am a journalist. I am writing a piece about the Staying Project and the essay on staying. Christine Adler gave me your contact information with your permission, I hope." I said, "Christine mentioned someone might call, yes." She said, "Mrs. Brooks, I want to ask you about the essay, about what you were thinking when you wrote it, about what it has meant to you to discover its reach." I said, "I am happy to talk, though I should tell you I am leaving for Lisbon in 3 weeks and my time is somewhat limited." She said, "Lisbon?" I said, "Yes." She said, "That is actually relevant to what I want to ask you." I said, "How so?" She said, "I have been reading everything I could find about you in preparation for this interview. Your teaching record, the conference presentations, the essay, and I found something I want to ask you about." I said, "Ask." She said, "There is a quote attributed to you from a 2009 conference on literature and identity. You were speaking about the essay. You said, 'The hardest thing about writing about staying is that I was not sure I believed it entirely. I was not sure the ordinary was enough. I wrote it to convince myself as much as anything else.'" The porch was very quiet. I said, "Yes, I said that." She said, "Did you mean it?" I said, "Yes." She said, And do you still believe it? That the ordinary might not be enough? I said, I believe the ordinary is essential. I no longer believe it is sufficient on its own. She said, what changed? I said, 9 years, and a garden on a Saturday morning in April. She said, the lavender. I said, Christine told you. She said, Christine told me everything. She said you decided to go to Lisbon because the lavender was moving in the wind. I said, that is a simplified version, but accurate enough. She said, Mrs. Brooks, I want to ask you something direct. I said, ask. She said, the essay is about the courage of staying, about choosing the ordinary, about the Tuesday morning. 400,000 people have read it and found something in it about remaining in their lives, and now you are leaving for 6 months. She said, does that feel like a contradiction? I sat with that question for a long time. The porch was warm. The August evening light was doing the particular thing it does in August in Connecticut, going golden and sideways and making everything look like it has been there forever. I said, no, it does not feel like a contradiction. She said, tell me why. I said, the essay is about deliberate choice, about choosing consciously rather than drifting. I have been in this house for 9 years. I have chosen it every day. I have tended it. I have addressed every situation that arrived at its door. I have loved it and protected it and known it as mine. I said, going to Lisbon is also a deliberate choice. It is choosing the Tuesday. A Tuesday that happens to be in Portugal. She said, you think the essay applies to leaving as much as to staying? I said, I think the essay is about paying attention to your life, about not sleepwalking through it. You can sleepwalk into staying the same way you can sleepwalk into leaving. The courage is in the waking up. She said, and the lavender woke you up. I said, the lavender reminded me that I had been choosing the house for 9 years and had stopped choosing the list. She said, the list. I said, Richard and I made a list in 1987, 14 places we wanted to go together. He died before we went anywhere on it. She said, and Lisbon is second on the list. I said, yes. She said, what is first? I said, Paris in autumn. I will go after Lisbon if the light in Lisbon is what Teresa says it is. Anna Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Brooks, can I tell you something? I said, yes. She said, I am 31 years old. I have been a journalist for 7 years. I have an apartment in Hartford. A job I am good at. A life that is adequate and organized and entirely predictable. She said, I read On Staying 3 years ago when my mother sent it to me. I read it and I thought, this is permission to stay in the adequate life, to choose the Tuesday, to stop looking at the list. She said, but that is not what you meant. I said, no, that is not what I meant. She said, you meant, look at the list, and then choose. Whatever you choose, choose deliberately. I said yes. She said, I have a list. I made it when I was 22. It is in a notebook under my bed. I said, when did you last look at it? She said, 3 years ago, when I read your essay. I took it out and looked at it and put it back. I said, Anna. She said, yes. I said, the interview. Are you going to write the article about the staying project? She said, yes, it will be a good article. I said, and after the article? She was quiet. She said, I do not know. I said, the notebook is under your bed. She said, yes. I said, you know where it is. She said, yes. I said, that is enough for now. We spoke for another 40 minutes about the essay and the staying project and Christine and the 4,000 questions and what I planned to say to 400,000 people when I spoke at the annual gathering. Before she hung up, she said, Mrs. Brooks, the article, may I call it, The Woman Who Wrote About Staying and Then Left for Lisbon? I said, you may call it whatever you like. It is your article. She said, I think that is the most honest title. I said, yes, I think it probably is. After the call, I sat on the porch for a long time. The August light was gone by then. The garden was dark, the lavender invisible but present the way things are present in the dark when you know exactly where they are. I thought about Anna Chen and her notebook under her bed. I thought about Margaret Solis calling her daughter from the parking lot. I thought about Daniel in Boston choosing his spot for 8 months. I thought about all the ways people carry their lists, and I thought, the only wrong thing you can do with a list is forget where you put it. If this moment reached something in you, leave me a comment. Tell me if you have a list. Tell me what is on it. Tell me if you have looked at it lately. I read every single one. I arrived in Lisbon on the 14th of September. The flight was 9 hours. I slept for 4 of them and spent the remaining 5 looking out the window at the Atlantic below and thinking about Richard saying, "Be specific." Teresa met me at the apartment. She was 61 years old. Small, precise. She had the particular quality of someone who has lived in the same place for a long time and has made a specific peace with it. She showed me everything. The kitchen, the terrace, the angle between the 2 buildings where the river appeared. She said through the translation app, "The morning light comes in from the east. It hits the terrace at 7:45. I suggest you be there." I said, "I will be there," she said. "Also, the bakery on the corner. They open at 6. The bread is ready by 7. You should go early. The good ones go fast." I said, "I understand bread that goes fast." She said, "You will like it here." She left. I stood on the terrace. The light was not the same as Connecticut light. Teresa was right about that, and the 3 books were right, and I could see immediately why Richard had put it on the list. It was not warmer or brighter. It was more honest somehow. The way it came in at that particular angle made everything it touched look exactly like what it was. No flattering, no obscuring, just the thing itself in the light. I stood there for a long time. Then I went inside and I unpacked. I put my medications in the kitchen cabinet. I put the list, the original paper from 1987, folded and soft at the creases, on the kitchen table. I put my book on the windowsill. Then I made tea, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked at the list. 14 places. Lisbon was crossed off now. I had crossed it off on the plane with the pen I keep in my bag. 13 places remaining. I called Lucas at 9 in the morning Connecticut time. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Mom, are you there?" I said, "I am here." He said, "How is it?" I said, "Teresa was right about the light." He said, "Good." He said, "Mom, the garden. Linda came yesterday. She said the lavender is doing well." I said, "Tell her I said thank you." He said, "She said to tell you, go slowly. The lavender will wait." I said, "Linda understands lavender." He said, "She said to tell you something else." I said, "What?" He said, "She said, tell Eleanor that Gerald would have liked Portugal. He grew tomatoes. Portuguese soil is good for tomatoes." I said, "Linda knew Gerald." Lucas said, "Apparently they met through the hospice where you both volunteer. She did not know you knew his wife until you told her about Margaret." I said, "Small world." He said, "Or the right size." I said, "Yes, or the right size." I went to the bakery on the corner at 6:47 on my first morning. The woman behind the counter was named Fatima. She said, "You are new." I said, "I arrived yesterday." She said, "How long are you staying?" I said, 6 months, perhaps longer." She said, "Perhaps longer. That is a good answer." She gave me the bread. I took it to the terrace. The light arrived at 7:45 as Teresa had said. I sat with the bread and the light and the river appearing between the 2 buildings, and I thought, yes, this is exactly what the list is for. I emailed Anna Chen that afternoon. I said, "The light is what Teresa said it would be. You should look under your bed." She wrote back 4 hours later. She said, "I looked. The first thing on my list is Lisbon." I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote, "The bakery on the corner. Ask for Fatima. Tell her Eleanor sent you." She wrote, "When?" I wrote, "When you are ready. Or before you think you are, whichever comes first." She did not write back that day. She wrote back 3 weeks later. She said, "I booked it. February, 1 week." I said, "The bread will be waiting." She said, "Mrs. Brooks, the article came out yesterday." I said, "What did you call it?" She said, "The woman who wrote about staying and then left for Lisbon." I said, "That is a good title." She said, "It has been shared quite a bit." I said, "How much is quite a bit?" She said, "Christine Adler shared it. So did the Staying Project. As of this morning, 412,000 times." I looked at the river between the buildings. I thought, of course they did. I wrote, "Anna, one more thing." She said, "Yes." I said, "The article. Did you say anything about the list?" She said, "I said you had a list of 14 places, that Lisbon was second, that you had crossed it off on the plane with a pen you keep in your bag." I said, "Good." She said, "I also said that the hardest thing about a list is not making it. It is remembering where you put it." I said, "That is a very good sentence." She said, "I learned it from an essay I read 3 years ago." It is October. I have been in Lisbon for 3 weeks. I go to the bakery every morning at 6:47. Fatima has started putting aside one of the good ones for me without being asked. I sit on the terrace at 7:45. The light arrives exactly when Teresa said it would. I have been writing. Not the essay, something else. Something that does not have a shape yet, but is becoming one. The way things become when you give them the right light and enough time. Lucas called yesterday. He said, "Mom, the lavender." I said, "Linda trimmed it." He said, "She did, and she left something on your kitchen table. She said you would know what it was." I said, "What is it?" He said, "A small jar, with a label that says, Gerald's Tomatoes, September harvest." I sat on the terrace and looked at the river. Gerald grew tomatoes. Linda knew Gerald. Margaret wore the earrings from the first anniversary. The hardest thing is not the staying, it is the seeing. I wrote that in 2002 about Richard at the kitchen table. I crossed Lisbon off the list on a plane over the Atlantic. 12 places remaining. Paris in autumn is next. I do not know what the light is like in Paris in autumn. I intend to find out. Richard said, "Be specific." He was right about that. He was usually right about the things that mattered. I am 63 years old and I have 12 places left on the list, and bread waiting at the bakery on the corner, and light that comes in at 7:45, and a river that appears between 2 buildings at exactly the right angle. That is not nothing. That is everything. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Do you have a list? Tell me what is on it. Tell me if you have looked at it lately. Tell me if something is stopping you. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you today, subscribe, because next week's story will stay with you too.